So hi, I'm Mani Bindra. I'm also a principal software engineer, same group as Ritesh who just spoke. His team focuses on AI, my team focuses more on security. So yeah, today we'll be speaking about no more overprivileged service principles. In fact, try and not use service principles at all, managed identities. How many of you have worked on Azure? Uh, yeah, quite a few. And for infrastructure deployments, what tools do you use generally?
Azure DevOps,
Okay, for IAC, so in Azure DevOps to deploy something, Bicep,
Bicep.
Bicep.
Right now, not Terraform.
Okay. Anybody uses something else, Terraform or ARM?
We use Argo CD for deployment,
Okay.
Docker Kubernetes, Argo CD, and Terraform
For the IAC, infrastructure as code, right?
yeah.
Okay. So Terraform. Anybody else uses Terraform for the deployments? How Bicep you said,
Bicep,
and
yes.
Bicep. Okay. Right. And when you are like using, so yeah, the agenda is we'll discuss that why what we are discussing, why least privileges matter for your service principles or managed identities associated with a infrastructure as code deployment, and we'll then discuss how the minimum permission finder utility could help you, and we'll also see how it works and then demo best practices, and uh, then we'll also see that how GitHub Copilot agent mode. This was not in the initial talk agenda, but since during an engagement we found this to be really useful, I'll be talking a bit about this. So how GitHub Copilot agent mode with the minimum permission finder integration can make the barrier to get started with this utility a bit lower. And then we'll also talk about contributions. Since it's open source utility, there are already contributions to it from the community, so that's really great. So we discussed what some people use Bicep, some people use Terraform, and for that Bicep or Terraform, what permissions do you give to the utility? Is it contributor, or do you know what permissions you give? Do you run Terraform like from your machine or through a pipeline, Azure DevOps or GitHub?
Bicep. We use Bicep.
Pipeline, right? So in the pipeline, you associate like a service principal, which has certain permissions on the Azure subscription. Now, what permissions do you give? By default, I mean, I've seen few folks using contributor or even owner in those pipelines, right? So that is very common, and why you shouldn't do that, right? Or what are some issues when you do that? Deployments could be direct, like when you use Bicep or Terraform directly, or sometimes even things like Azure policies. Anyone used Azure policies? In that, there are remediation tasks where you again specify like an ARM template. So that also is treated as a deployment, and if you need to find the minimum permissions for that, the utility can help you. Anyway, what's the issue with using a contributor or owner? You must have, like, every day we see different attacks or breaches. So say your the pipeline is compromised somehow, right? And if you've given it contributor access, somebody can do anything. They can create, they can delete anything, right? So that's why using owner for everything is like really bad. Okay.
Zero trust policy.
Zero trust, exactly. So ideally zero trust is the way, so the minimum permissions, but we will discuss what could be a good middle ground, right? Okay, so why restrict permissions we discussed. Then how do we find the minimum permissions? Okay, so we said we shouldn't use contributor or owner. Now if you have a Terraform code or you have Bicep code, how do you find out what the minimum permissions needed are? Any thoughts? Manually, one way is manually, right? You manually try to figure out if you're creating a VM, then you need, if you're creating a resource group, then resource group slash write that permission. But when the code gets complex, the IAC infrastructure as code gets complex, Terraform or Bicep, then it's difficult. So can anyone tell me what this is? People who've used Terraform. So Terraform has like a Terraform graph where it creates a dependency graphs, and this is from a real project. So which uses Azure verified modules, and then so it manually doing this using is going to be not going to be possible, and even if you were to try, yeah, you'll not get the right answer. So yeah, so the utility which we are going to talk about is the minimum permission finder, or MPF. This is the path. I'll go to the site shortly. Maybe we can do it now.
Have you gone to the site now, the repo? Abhi le lo video, baad mein like when you're doing workshop, please go back to that slide. This is a GitHub repo? Open
Yes,
it.
yes.
Yes? So can you do money and his team a favor? Can you star a repo? ये लोग जीते star पे. Thank you. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. So I think this font, maybe I'll reduce the font a little bit. Okay. So yeah, we are going to discuss how the utility works in more detail in a bit. But yeah, the repository also has information, but I'll go into a bit more detail, and we'll discuss some of the other aspects of this repository after we cover the demo maybe. But so how does it work? When you log into Azure, right? So AZ CLI, how many of you have used like Azure CLI? Command line, yeah. Sometimes. How about you? Okay. So when you figure out the minimum permissions, the way the design, the approach which the utility takes is, we use like a default credential. So when you log into AZ CLI or via pipeline, if you log in, so it uses two sets of identities and permissions. So this is the one which you normally log in to, and this other one is a service principal which you use, which initially has no permissions at all, right? And then what happens is, so you initially start, you remove all the role assignments with this, for this service principal, which we are in this context. So the service principal, we remove all the permissions. Okay, then we create a new custom role. So if Azure has the concept of a role, so initially this service principal has no permissions, and what you're going to do is, you're going to associate the service principal with a custom role which has no permissions, and then you try the deployment. So if it is Bicep or Terraform, you try the deployment, and then naturally, since the service principal does not have any permissions, Terraform or Bicep or ARM is going to throw an error of this format, right? Authorization failed. The client does not have permission to perform action Microsoft/container services or whatever that resource is. It does not have this permission, right, over this scope. And then what we do is we parse that. So the whole logic what the utility does is it knows how to parse all these different authorization errors and pull the missing permissions from it. So in the first iteration, it's figured out that the missing permissions, missing action is Microsoft/container service managed clusters/write. This is just a sample. Depending on what you're trying to create, the error will be different, right? And then in iteration 2, it will maybe give a slightly different, that you don't have read permission. So then you'll add it to the custom role, then retry again. Then you'll maybe get a third, like network/virtual networks. You don't have permissions to create a virtual network. So that permission error you'll get. The utility will parse that error, and then we'll add it to the custom role. And then eventually, when this custom role has all the required permissions, you'll be able to deploy. Okay, and that's how this utility figures out the minimum permissions. Yeah, and after that, once it's figured out the minimum permissions, it removes, deletes any resources it's created. Now for ARM and Bicep, the utility does not create any resources. It uses the what if endpoint which Azure has. Anyone use that what if endpoint ever? Like if you're doing something via Bicep, you can do what if I do this? Like it's kind of like Terraform plan. Yeah. So anyway, for ARM and Bicep, no resources are created, but for Terraform, the utility actually creates all the resources and then destroys all the resources and figures out all the missing permissions. Okay. So I'm going to move to the demo. So for Bicep and ARM, I'm going to run it here, but for Terraform, it actually shows the Terraform plan with my subscription ID, which I don't want to share with you guys. So I've masked that in a screencast, and I'm just going to share that. But let's get started with Bicep and ARM. So as I said, this utility needs a service principal, right, which initially has no permissions. So I will set some environment variables for the service principal, the MPF client ID, object ID, and initially I have not given ---- verbose or ---- debug. You can do this for ARM or Bicep because it's very fast. Even for a complex template, it takes about less than 2 minutes. So it's fine if you do it for ARM or Bicep, but don't do it for Terraform, because Terraform, it actually creates the resources. If you do run it without the verbose, you're going to see nothing, and then in 10 minutes, if nothing happens, you will not know whether something has failed or not. So now for Bicep, I said I've not run it with the ---- verbose, but I've also timed it, so we'll know that how long this whole operation took. This is a relatively simple template, so I would say about 60-70 seconds is what it would take, and for a complex one, it would take about between 90 seconds and 2 minutes. Okay, so it just returned the required permissions, but since we did not use ---- verbose, we don't know now how this utility actually worked. So next I'm going to run it for ARM, right? This was for Bicep. So AZMPF Bicep, I gave the Bicep file path, right, and the parameter file path, right? Those are the flags. Now I'm going to run it for ARM. So and this time I'm going to give ---- verbose, right? So and I'm also going to give show detailed output and ---- verbose. So it'll start showing me the messages. So it's creating like a temporary. It's deleting all the existing role assignments to the service principal which we specified. Then as I said, it will try the deployment. It will use the what if endpoint. The way the what if endpoint works is that when you submit a deployment to it, it gives you a URL, and then you have to check whether the result is returned or not. So in the first iteration, it got like an error. It parsed that error, so it's telling us that okay, and now it's adding the missing permissions. Yeah, and then after about 2-3 iterations, so this is a slightly complex template. All this is there on the repo as well. All these test templates are there on the repo. As I said, it's a complex one, so it will take about maybe less than 2 minutes and a few iterations, maybe 3-4 iterations, right? So and then it will return a set of values. And the other thing we did here was we gave the flag ---- show detailed output. Previously, we just got a set of permissions. Here we'll also get that set of permissions, but additionally it will also tell us that for each sub resource type, what are the permissions needed. Okay, so authorization successful. So that means we've got all the required permissions. So it took about 1 minute 34 seconds, and let's just have a look at what the permissions were. So yeah, at the top level, it will give you, all the permissions. It's a big list, right? So, and then it will also, after the big list, since we gave show detailed output, it's also going to show you that what are the permissions required for the virtual machine extensions or for private endpoint read, private endpoint write. So for each sub resource also it will show you that okay, these are the overall permissions, and then at a granular level also it gives you the details because we gave show detailed output. Now as I said, we are moving on to Terraform, but Terraform I can't run it because if I run it, then firstly, since if I run it with verbose, it's going to output the errors with the subscription ID, which I don't want to share with you folks. So what I'm going to do is the next best thing. So I'm using Askinema, and this basically I created a screenshot like a screencast, and then I just replaced my subscription ID with a masked value. So I'm going to speed through. So when I did this demo, I also first I did the same thing. I first ran it for Bicep and then for ARM. So I'm going to just, we've already seen it in real time. So I'm going to move past ARM Bicep, and then I'm just going to go to the Terraform. Yeah, so now we are running it for Terraform. So this is again, as I said, this is a recording which I can speed up. So Terraform typically takes quite long. So for we'll see for this one it maybe took 4 or 5 minutes because it was a simple Terraform file, but yeah, it is similar. So when you run it with verbose, as I said, or debug, it will also show you the Terraform plan output. So yeah, people who've worked on Terraform, they'll find this, you know, they've seen this before. But what you will see is that in this Terraform, this is the actual error which Terraform throws. When you try to deploy it with a service principal which does not have the permissions, it will actually tell you the client, I've masked the ID with client with this ID does not have authorization to perform Microsoft.resources subscription resource group read over the scope that particular resource group, right? So yeah, so that's it actually. Then after that, we parse that error, and so the utility passed that error successfully, and then it adds the missing permissions, right? And this continues as we discussed for a few iterations, right? And then in the end, it will like give us all the missing permissions. After this, we'll also look at so yeah, this took about 3 minutes, 3.5 minutes for Terraform, which is creation of the resources and also deletion of the resources, because it was a simple one. But for a huge Terraform template, it can take, if it takes you 40 minutes for the normal deployment, this will take you 40 minutes plus the time to delete. So if it takes you to run Terraform, plan, apply and destroy it, total of 60 minutes, this is going to take you a bit more than that because you're trying it for a few iterations, about 70 minutes or so. But imagine I'm going to share one template, like a real world sample with you now. Okay. Yeah, so this is like a real world sample. Okay. So it's giving you hundreds of permission, and in this case, it took it 40 iterations. So if you try to manually, if you were to manually figure out the permissions, it's going to take you hours, right? So and it's still, you're going to make mistakes. So even for Terraform, in fact, most of the projects where we've gone live, in those cases, folks were using Terraform. So yeah, and then again, it gives you, when you do the JSON output, it also gives you all the detailed level breakup of the overall permissions. Any questions so far? Okay, best practices of this, yeah, you won't run this ever in your production environments. You will run it in the dev environment or a lower environment, right? Because you won't have, nobody will give you. So what permissions do you need for the utility? So the first slide which I had, right? This particular service principal, it needs to have role definition create, role definition write, role definition delete, because we create a new custom role each time. And this is again there on the repo as well. And then since we are changing we are assigning this role to this service principal, we need the role assignments permission as well. Yeah, and for ARM and Bicep, we create a resource group for the what if analysis. So that's why you need the resource group, add, create, delete, yeah, permissions and read permissions. So yeah, that was the first thing. Yeah, you will always run it in a lower environment. Okay, supported providers. So let's go to the repo. So supported deployment providers, we have like there's ARM, right? So for ARM deployments, you can use it. You can use it for Bicep deployments. Bicep basically first, if you do a Bicep, build. So when you deploy using Bicep, a Bicep file, it actually internally first generates the ARM template JSON and then deploys that. Terraform is also supported. Earlier, we supported what if analysis for ARM templates and Bicep and full deployment, where it similar to Terraform, it actually deploys the resources. We deprecated it, but looks like it's going to come back on, because in few cases, the what if analysis does not return a couple of permissions. So we are also going to bring this back, the full deployment of ARM and Bicep. Yeah, and then now using this, you can create a custom role with the minimum permissions required. Does that mean for everything you always create the minimum permissions? That is going to create, then you'll have to create a lot of custom roles. Maybe in some production scenarios it's valid, but say a user wants to experiment with something, experiment deploying a template. Then if you give them minimum permissions, then they will not be able to create any additional resources. So maybe in that case, you can, if you look at the minimum permissions, it's easy to figure out that which are the built-in roles I can give, which have a bit more permission than the minimum permissions, which will allow the user to experiment. So in many cases, combination of these built-in roles will suffice, and looking at the minimum permissions, you can figure out which are the built-in roles. In fact, if you use Copilot in agent mode, or even ask it that these are the minimum permissions, can you recommend built-in roles? It will give you reasonably, I mean, most of the time, very accurate ones, but you need to validate. Okay, so now one feedback we got was the barrier to using the utility. So if you go to the utility installation pages, right, we know that this utility requires, so first you have to download it. This is straightforward, but still for some users who are not used to terminals a lot, they might find it difficult. And then creating a service principal, people might not have done that. It's straightforward, but yeah. So one feedback was that, okay, we need to make it even easier for users to use. So what I'll do is, so what we did was, let me share my screen. Okay, this one. Okay, so this is like Copilot agent mode. I'm using GPT-4o, and then I told it that I gave it a prompt. Okay, that this is a command line tool. This is the installation link to the installation markdown. This is the link to the display options and command line flags. I want to test my Terraform code in this particular folder. Okay, and so can you please help me? So I tried it a few times. Every time, I mean, since it's non-deterministic, it follows slightly different, it makes some errors, but the good thing is it recovers, it figures out what it needs to change. So in this case, when I gave it, it started with, I also told it that feel free to delete any prior versions of this particular utility. So it said, okay, first this is GitHub Copilot, that okay, I'm going to delete this, the existing files which are there and the license file. So it fetch the quick start. So I said, okay, do it, go ahead, install the utility. And the good thing is it figured out that I'm on a Mac M1, so the version it has to download is the Darwin ARM64, right? So if you look here, it figured out that okay, it needs to download this particular version. In one of the cases, it first downloaded the wrong one, but then it figured out and then it downloaded. But in this case, it straight away downloaded the right version. it followed all the steps which are there in the installation. It created the local AZ MPF utility, and then it told me, okay, I will now proceed to install the MPF CLI following these steps. So I said, yeah, please proceed. Okay, and then it actually installed it, and then it said, okay, now the utility is installed on your machine. Should I create the required service principal? I said, yeah, please proceed. I always am careful with AI, so I say please always, right? Someday it might help me. So yeah, then it actually so it actually created, like, followed the steps, like created the service principal, set the environment variables needed, right? And then it said that, okay, now I'm going to run Terraform for it. I said, yeah, proceed. And then when it ran, then it gave an error. And then it figured out that the error is because it's not provided the Terraform executable path, right? So it said the MPF utility returned an error indicating that the required flag, the TF path flag, was not set. This flag is mandatory for the utility. So it figured it out from the flags details on the repository. I will now set the TF path flag, and then it set minus TF path is equal to which Terraform, right? And then this time it ran. The only mistake it made is that maybe I need to, it was my mistake that the documentation is not clear enough. But for Terraform, it did not run using minus verbose or minus debug. So then, like, for it took, this is a big template, so it took about 24 minutes, and yeah, and then it gave me the permissions. And then I also told it, okay, these are the permissions which the utility has returned. Can you suggest the built-in roles? So that also it did a pretty good job. So as I said, it did a pretty good job of suggesting which built-in roles I could use. And as I said, since it did not give, like, I actually recorded this, and so in the middle there is a big gap for about 20 minutes where nothing happens, and then the results are displayed. But yeah, so it did quite well. I am experimenting with the GPT-4.1, and at some point I'll put the prompts which I know to be working for Bicep, ARM, Terraform on the repository itself. Yeah, contributions are welcome. There are good first issues which are easy to get started with. So yeah, please feel free to contribute. Okay, I told you, it's not a big session at all. There are not many questions actually. Not many questions.
Okay. Because we have not many folks who have deployed this. They have not understood paisa ka bill aayega na और audit में fail होगा तो सबका question उन लोग का question पूछेंगे. Okay, any more questions for Mani? Okay, director
One
ji.
question.
Sure.
So, ideally, I have not deployed this. We just maintain the Bicep.
Hmm.
So DevOps permission or service principal which are given.
Hmm.
So, ideally, what I can try on my account. So, the idea is this, whatever the template we have, Terraform or anything,
Hmm.
we have the tool,
Hmm.
then we run the script, and it gives us the permission. And
The
then
minimum permissions
we'll,
required.
add it to the service or whatever.
Yes, service principal or managed identity. So ideally, now both GitHub, Azure DevOps, I always avoid in my pipelines, I avoid using service principal. So you can use a managed identity, and then you can set up the OIDC authentication with either Azure DevOps or GitHub, federated credentials basically. So you don't have to store the service principal secret, because what I've seen is nobody rotates those secrets in GitHub or in Azure DevOps. Like in Azure DevOps, yeah, you can create a service connection by default, but managed identity is much more secure. So I would always recommend that.
So same thing can be done for Dev QA.
So in Dev, you will run it and get the minimum permissions, and then maybe in like a test environment, you don't need to. Yeah, for the deployment, you can have the minimum permissions or slightly higher if you want, because
And same role can be used.
because every time you add something, say you know in integration test, now you are adding a resource, so that deployment is going to fail now because you didn't have the minimum permissions.
You
So yeah, you have to calculate. So normally we run it in a pipeline. This like a nightly build, you can calculate the minimum permissions. That can.
App that takes this. Do we have like a blog that takes? Okay, you created app.
Yes. So there's a blog post. I will share it.
And what else? I think this is a good point you have raised. So what we'll do is basically now my next session in research.
Yeah.
We are going to deploy an Azure, suppose. So
Hmm.
I think so. This will be a good test case. How
Yeah.
to take it from that, but from dev to staging to production.
Yep.
What permission and support like and the OSS project, right? So you can take contribution, run from LC goes about do that. So we'll do that whole blog post.
Yeah, I think for personal project, managing infra is too much.
Yeah, yeah. But like if
And
you
also DevOps people handle in companies, right?
exactly in the company in the production, you if you are using owner to do everything, it is not recommended.
It is not. It is prohibited. Don't recommend the party to use.
Don't. So and I have seen it actually in few places where people are using
use
contributor.
ownership.
Many people I have seen using, but even some places even higher permissions.
Cool. Can we off the recording, please? And a round of applause for Manny.
Thank you. Thank you.